meteorology, and he holds a BSc from the University of South Africa in operational research. He does have as well an MSc from the University of Witwatersrand and a PhD from the Da Vinci Institute of Technology. In addition to this, Greg has undertaken a number of academic courses, both nationally and internationally, related to technology and science. Example of this is the John F. Kennedy School of Governance, Harvard University, Mobilizing Science and Technology for Sustainable Development. In terms of his work background, Gregory Tosen is semi-retired. However, he currently has taken on the position of faculty head in the management of technology and systems theory at the Da Vinci Business School. He supervises a number of MSc students in the area of technology leadership, innovation, and systems thinking. He also acts as an external examiner for a number of South African universities and has published widely. Greg was previously a general manager at Eskom's Research and Development Group. Welcome, Greg. I'm not going to waste any more time. Over to you. We'll have your presentation first, and then we will follow your presentation with a question and answer session after that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. I do appreciate that, and welcome everybody. I'll say good day because if you're different parts of the world, it's either, if it's east, it'll be nighttime. If it's west, it'll be morning, and Europe and us will be evening. So welcome to you all today, and it's really a pleasure doing a presentation, and really I'm looking for it to be a interactive session when we get to the discussion and processes, because I think it's important. So really what I'd like to do today is really just take you through a journey of both systems thinking and design thinking. And as you can see from my title, design thinking or systems thinking, that is the question. And I'm going to really critique both, and then as we get to the end of my discussion and presentation, I'm really looking at you all to help me answer the question. What is the question in terms of the process? So my agenda today is really, I'm going to give you a background to how my interest in both, in particular, design thinking came across. I'm going to take you through the critique of systems thinking in terms of the history and putting systems thinking into context in terms of perspective, commonsenses, and of course some of the disadvantages. And then on the other side, we will look at design thinking and in terms of the origins, what is design thinking, both from a global perspective and my perspective. And I think it's important to understand that the presentation is really coming from my perspective and my understanding, and then look at the limitations in terms of the process. But I think and then of course, finally, I'm going to ask, what is the question or what is the answer? We need to start looking and say, where do we go to from here? Just some background, and I think it's important just to frame and put it into context and what got me going in undertaking the study. And really it started, about 12, 13 months ago, when a very good friend of mine, an academic, not working with me, working in another academic institution, said to me, "Hey, Greg, I'm doing a course, well, I'm going to facilitate a course with an international company, a local international company, on design thinking, and I'm going to give the design thinking a process, and I'm going to facilitate." And I looked at his background, by the way, was education and marketing, and I said to him, I said, "But hey," I said, you've never undertaken any systems thinking course." No, he said, "It's easier. I just went onto Google and I looked at some of the courses, and because I have a PhD, the consultancy that are using me said I must go forward and make it happen." So it really set my mind in terms of, how are we actually facilitating the concept of systems, of design thinking. And then I I started looking at and observing over the last few months or last couple of months the way design thinking has been taught in our country at various institutions, and not all the institutions, but just getting a feel, empirical feel, and discussion and within consultants, because design thinking is a buzzword, eh? I mean, everybody talks about design thinking and how great it is for business, and of course, businesses are spending thousands of rands on training and of course expecting good returns. So when I looked at some of the processes and the packages of design thinking, I can see they were pretty neatly packages, curriculum friendly, and as I said, it's a lot of colleges, universities, and I even noticed in my review and that even it's been taught at some schools in the US. And I thought, okay, well, let's see what we talk about here and how do we move forward. And what was to me very concerning from the observations I made is that I began to realize that increasingly, and perhaps even in predominantly cases, um, facilitators and lecturers were people that had no real formal understanding of systems thinking. And I got the feeling they were just driving a simplistic attitude to design and really serving no further um, obscurities in terms of the complexities that are detailed and required in real design thinking in terms of understanding the system. And then I thought, well, okay, let me look a little bit further, and I then went and looked at some empirical studies and looked at some of the work that were perhaps a bit critical, uh, and some of the limitations of the design thinking effectiveness. And I read an influential study by the University of California, Berkeley, and Aalto University in Finland, where they failed to find any statistical evidence that design thinking led to better solutions. And the experiment involved something like 15,000 participants across 17 countries. However, what they did say is that design thinking did appear, and I'll use the word appear to help novices, but they found that experts performed equally well without or without the methodology. And so my question arose is that how are we actually facilitating? Is it a hype? Is design thinking a big hype? Has it been well marketed? And are we actually giving the value that is required to our learners, to our end users? And again, I further explored and I realized that design thinking principles are not as novel as we claim, or as it being claimed, because the concepts of empathy, brainstorming, and iteration, which is central to design thinking, have been around for decades and have been adopted in design, engineering, and social sciences for many ways. And of course, if we strip away the hexagons, the buzzword, the visuals, um, there is actually little new about design thinking compared to any other problem solving or creative framework. So that's the context of the study, and I'm being controversial because I'm looking for feedback and discussion. I think this is critical in terms of the process. So let's talk a bit about systems thinking in its broader way. And here I want to talk about specifically systems thinking in context and what that has to offer in terms of the work that has been done. And I think firstly, it's always important to take a view historically. And so what is the history of general systems theory? And I think important to note that the first concept, and unfortunately you can't see the dates below there, but the first concepts of the idea of systems theory was that of Aristotle. We all know, a Greek philosopher and a polymath, and he really captured the idea of system theory in a statement that he made 300 years BC. That he said the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Um, and so the process of systemic thinking, systems thinking, has been around for many thousands of years. And then,
Sorry,
of
yeah.
course,
Oh,
sorry,
okay. I just saw the blank screen, so I was wondering if
okay, you
there was
find there.
error. All good,
Uh,
sorry.
No problem. And then, of course, and unfortunately, somehow you can't actually see. I'm trying to see if you can see the. No, you can't see it. Just go back. The dates below there. But in about 1926, Jan Smuts, who was the president in South Africa, really um, termed the statement of holism. It was a statement and a philosopher in a book that he wrote in 1926 called Holism and Evolution, and he introduced the notion of holism, and really built on the work of Aristotle. He visualized the universe, which comprised three wholes. It was matter, life, and mind. Interesting concept. And he was really can be seen the further of the father of holism. And interesting enough, he was also the founder of the United Nations. Interesting enough. And then, of course, things moved along. In 1946, um, the work of Ludwig Bertalanffy, he was given the title as the father of systems theory. And he was actually a botanist, an Austrian botanist, where he really looked at energy transformation and thermodynamics. And he really looked at the steady state of living organisms as an open system where they adapted to the external environment, continually adapting and changing. And I mean, the concept of homeostasis is really is really defined as a self-regulating process by which living systems maintain a certain stability, an internal stability, while adjusting to the changing environment. So clearly there was an open system. There was an understanding of the relationships and the connectivity both internally and to the external system. And then James Miller also um, around about 1940, 1950, really started talking about living systems theory. And he not only included the biological system, he was a botanist, by the way, and he included all systems that were living, and of course, very clearly, social systems, where he moved on. And then, of course, in the 50s, um, we get the movement to system dynamics, really in the engineering field, um, cognitive systems engineering, system architecture, and cybernetics. And of course, Jay Forrester was an electrical engineer, and really the founder of system dynamics. Of course, his classical book, still a classic book, and his first book titled Industrial Dynamics really looked at the process. And because of his ability, his unique ability to look at engineering and computational digital computing, he was able to actually do computer simulations and analyze social systems and predict the implications of a series of simulations. And of course, he's also, interesting enough, been known as the father of the term systems thinking. So a huge movement in terms of that. And of course, what is cybernetics? It's all about self-adapting systems, which links very closely to what uh, Ludwig was talking about in terms of understanding the system. And then, of course, we moved on to recently, the 1990s, and perhaps a little bit further on, because um, systems thinking in organizations, learning organizations, loosely and tightly coupled organizations. And of course, Peter Senge, in his book, The Fifth Discipline, which really is focused on learning organizations. And really, he developed 5 disciplines. And those 5 disciplines were around about personal mastery, mental models, shared vision, team learning, and of course, system thinking, and how this really integrates in a learning organization. A very quick view of the history of General systems theory, and of course moving into systems thinking as we move on. So what is something, and I believe, and I put this down because I think it's critical that we all understand, is what is the things that every person should know about systems thinking? First of all, we need to understand systems thinking is just not a natural act. It's not a natural act. And I think all of us who are involved in systems thinking realize that. And why isn't systems thinking a natural act? Well, I believe human evolution has favored very mechanistic views of dealing with problems. You know, we see problems as machines. You know, it's a downward movement. We look at the part and think that we fixed the part, we've solved the problem. And we've actually, I almost say, we've been genetically programmed to be like this. Very much so, to be like this. And so we have this reduction approach, and it's really driven by, and I'm going to say, mainly Western education, but education. You know, we study subjects, they're all in parts. We eventually finish our senior and secondary school, and we think we know how the world operates, and yet we haven't been taught the ability to think transdisciplinary, to think how they connect, how one impacts the other. So our education system is such that it is one of those areas that it makes us extremely difficult to think systemically. Important. And of course, another one which is really impacting our cognitive ability is that complexity of our systems really overwhelm our cognitive ability and our capability because we're bounded by rationality and predictability. And we talk about the magic number 7, plus or minus 2. And this is a famous paper written by Miller back in 1976, where he proposed the law of cognitive and information processing that humans can effectively process no more than 7 units or chunks of that of information, plus or minus 2. And so when you look at something like this, a causal loop diagram, our first processes, our cognitive ability is what is going on. We can't actually unpack this. So it's important that systems thinking is not a natural act, very much so. And I've realized that, and I'm sure all of you, when we sit down and we do causal loops diagrams, at times when we finished it and we sit back and we share it with our end users, they just don't get the gist of it. And it's really around about the fact that we've been programmed. We have a reductionist view of the world and this whole cognitive ability that we can only see things up to the magic number of 7. Important to understand that. So yes, our education system is one of the biggest inhibitors to systems thinking, and I think it's critical to understand that. I've realized that we can teach systems thinking, but not to everyone. And I think this is the critical issue. Some people just don't get it, and that's fine. I think we need to realize that and understand that it's not a sin if you don't understand it. It's people who have abilities that can grasp the bigger picture and understand the system in terms of interconnectivity patterns and connectivity and relationships. Others don't. And so we need to understand that in terms of how we actually move forward in defining and in actual fact practicing systems thinking. And I believe the best way, and I know when I talk to my students, is the best way to develop systems thinking is really through experiential learning. It's about playing, working, and understanding the complexities of life. And I think this is really important. Just some additional inhibitors to systems thinking. And I think it's important for us to grasp that because that's the context of where we need to move to. Because to be a good system thinker and apply system dynamics and processes, we need to understand those shortcomings that we need to perhaps overcome. I think environment and institutional constraints is something that we need to understand because incentives, traditions, and structure And here I have a Newtonian model, a top-down approach. You know, most organizations have this top-down approach, this Newtonian model. You know, I sit at the top and I tell you what to do. And really, this really kills the incentive of systems thinking. It's not an agile organization. It's not a flexible organization. A Newtonian model, better known as the founder's model, actually really inhibits an organization to think systemically. And I think this is critical. Systems thinking does not survive in organizations like this. And unfortunately, 95% of organizations today are really Newtonian. Perhaps somebody can give me the latest information, but this is exactly where we sit. And then, of course, work in organizations. And this is something quite interesting, where Adam Smith spoke about, and of course, Adam Smith was an economist and what they call a moral philosopher. And he wrote the book called The Wealth of Nations. I'm sure many of you heard it in 1776. He's often referred to as the father of capitalism. Interesting, eh? And he really put forward that for an economy to grow, or even more, for a business and a company to grow, we had to have specialists. Specialists is what we needed. And I think important to know, maybe specialists can crack some of those complex problems, but you know, you need generalists. And the very nature of being a generalist actually moves you into the systems thinking paradigm. And so a book that I recently read by Epstein, How Generalists Triumph in a Specialist World, really said that generalists create far greater value to businesses than specialists, because specialists at times really see the big picture, And so I just want to go back just one slide. I want to talk about a particular area which I think I need to talk about, is that Western education system is the biggest inhibitor. And when I talk about Western education system is the biggest inhibitor, I want to compare it to what happens in Eastern philosophy. And I think this is important. You know, Eastern philosophy posits that self is an illusion and that we are all interconnected. And why it is important? Because it helps us solve problems, whether they're mundane or abstract, and it helps us make a far better process in developing critical thinking in decision-making processes. And I think this is actually quite a profound statement, because it's very important today in the age of disinformation. And I think one of the most fundamental differences between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy is that Eastern philosophy tends to be a lot more holistic and spiritual, while Western philosophy is really something that is focused on individualism and rationality, something that we need to consider. So systems thinking is not about creative thinking. It's not a human activity, a superhuman activity. Clearly, it's not a natural act and it's not a silver bullet. So what is thinking system about? What's the ability? And I think we need to have an ability to understand certain parameters in terms of understanding the universe appropriately, because the system operates in the universe. We need to be able to understand the boundaries, again, because there's various boundaries in the system, and we need to see relationships and patterns, both within the system and between the universe. Holistically is important. And to understand the fact that complexity and nonlinear relationships exist. And I think, to me, even more important is the fact that we need to bring multiple perspectives and to communicate this across disciplines, because there's a broad range of concepts. And important is that We look at principles, we apply models, methods, and tools. And it's important that we just don't apply any one method. We need to look at the broad spectrum of processes in terms of understanding the ability to conceptualize systems thinking. Now, I'm sure all of you know the Cynefin framework, and I'm going to just share with you the Cynefin framework because it's a critical aspect in the process of systems thinking. Now, the Cynefin framework was developed by Snowden, and really it helps people and designers and even leaders understand there are different domains to help us require to make decision makings. If you know where the domain is, you can actually utilize the Cynefin framework to assist you in sort of techniques and processes. And of course, we have the simple domain. And I like to say it's you know what you know. It's a tightly constrained, it's sense, categorize, and respond. And you know what the cause and effect is. When the light bulb goes out, you know what you do. You replace the light bulb. And so it's best practice. It's a simple process. It's a tightly constrained system, and there's no degrees of freedom. When we get to the complicated, and I like to say it's called, you know what you don't know. You know the cause, but you have to work on the effect. And so it's good practice. It's about sense, analyze, and respond. This is where your specialists sit in the back room and and your specialists, these are the most conservative guys, where you give them a task and they look at how they can solve the cause and effect relationship. Important. And then, of course, the complex domain. And here I call it, you don't know what you know. And this is where cause and effect is not clearly defined. It's really looking at cause and effect relationships and coming up with an answer. Say, oh, that's happened. We need to look at that. And then you do it again and you get a different answer. So it's really probe, sense, and respond. And we see emergent practices happening. And it's very much what we call loosely coupled systems. And then, of course, chaotic is you just don't know what you don't know. And here it's just a question of, you know, act, sense, respond. Go into it and act, sense, respond, because cause and effect is really chaotic in terms of the process. Now, when we look at this, I believe systems thinking really sits in the complex domain where we look at systems thinking and apply, but it doesn't preclude the fact that in systems thinking practice, we also look at the complicated, the simple, and try to some degree look at the chaotic in trying to making sense of, in actual fact, what is happening in the system that we're looking at. Important to understand that. And to bring a quote from Peter Senge, and I think this is important, and it brings clarity to how we view the world as individuals, is that in the presence of greatness, pettiness disappears. In the in the absence of the great dream, pettiness prevails. Reality is made up of circles, but all we see is straight lines. A very profound statement, and this is some of the inhibitors in terms of really conceptualizing and getting to grips with systems thinking. And I thought I'd just show this. I saw the slide and I added something there too. There are some questions that can't be answered by Google or even AI. And I added that as a mission because it's important. So what are some of the difficulties in systems thinking? And I'm just going to highlight a few. I think complexity is a difficulty because systems thinking often involves analyzing complex interconnections and relationships. And sometimes we can be overwhelmed. And I know even difficult to grasp. Important. Mental models is something which I think is critical because it requires a shift in thinking from linear thinking, cause and effect, to a process of nonlinear feedback loops and nonlinear relationships. It's a mind shift. It's a process that we need to understand. And we know it's time consuming. A key area which I found in working with systems thinking is the whole issue around subjectivity. And I'm sure many of you have felt the same, is that interpreting systems can sometimes be subjective. In actual fact, in most cases, it's subjective. And it does lead to disagreements or differing perspectives on the underlying dynamics, but that's okay. That's what it's about. It's about interactive design, working together in terms of looking at how we need to actually come up in terms of understanding the systems of causal relationships. I think one of the key areas that I believe is the lack of specificity, and really perhaps this is something we need to work on, is that systems thinking may not always provide a clear, actionable solution to problems, as it tends to focus on holistic understanding rather than specific interventions. And this ambiguity makes it really difficult to implement in practice, particularly for organizations who are time sensitive or resource constraints and they want to make things happen. So I think it's important to understand that there are difficulties, and I think perhaps even in some cases disadvantages, but we need to work through those processes. Important. So let's talk. So I've spoken about systems thinking. Now I want to now put design thinking in context in terms of where we've come from. And again, let's look at the origins of design thinking. And it really covers a broad spectrum, and I'm going to just touch on a few. In the early 70s, Herbert Simon and Robert McKing were actually really started looking at, and I think Herbert Hyman was a Nobel laureate, really started looking at rudimentary type of design processes, which they sort of looked and applied in science and engineering, and looked at those particular aspects. And then, of course, Brian Lawson applied to architectural discourse. He addressed design in architecture, and it was quite interesting because it was the first time that people started introducing the idea of designers working in architecture, where they looked at really what they call the human dimension in a participatory democratic environment. And it was quite interesting. Lawson undertook some work. He was a professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Sheffield. And it was very interesting. He did a couple of tests, and he got scientists together. He got architects together, and he asked them to solve the same ambiguous problem. And they all sat down and they solved the problem. And when he looked at the results, he concluded that scientists were predominantly problem solvers, where designers were predominantly solution focused. A very interesting concept. And I try to get a feel on the two definitions of problem solvers. So my view of problem solvers spend a lot of time focusing on the problems, where solution solvers acknowledge that there is a problem, but they focus on assessing the best solution for a given desired outcome. So that was quite interesting in terms of Lawson's view. Of course, Nigel Cross introduced design thinking into the general education area, resulting in a far better acceptance of design thinking and into the education system. And of course, in 1991, David Kelly from IDEO, really the founder and of the design consultancy IDEO, really got to grips with this and adapted design thinking in business. It became a commercial, and it was hugely successful. And he did a number of high case studies as well. And so you can see the progression of design thinking as a subject really moved from the elementary through to architecture, and then into organizational design. And you can see that it's really growing rapidly. Companies are moving forward. Now, very interesting, I read an article which was a bit critical in terms of the process, and they made a comment. They said, regrettably, design thinking has evolved from an industrial approach to something superficial. From 1992, the popularity of design thinking would also become one of its greatest weaknesses. And I think it's something that one needs to consider in terms of the history. Well, this is what the literature says, and I'll leave it to you to actually discuss it when we discuss it at the end of the presentation. Very interesting. And you've all seen this picture of design thinking. There's many, and what hits me here is hexagons, hexagons, hexagons. You know, D-Design and IDEO love hexagons. And I thought to myself, why hexagons? Because IDEO and D-Design at Stanford and MIT talk about hexagons. And I looked at this and I thought, okay, the reason why we have hexagons is that we talk about hexagonal thinking. And they're using design thinking as a process to create and be creative way to map out concepts and collaborate with others to develop more significant ideas of the topic. This is why they use hexagon. And the comment was made that hexagonal shapes allow for multiple connections to be made between new ideas, forming a web of interconnected concepts. And this can lead to more comprehensive understanding of the problem at hand and to foster innovative solutions. Now, it's interesting. However, you know, my view is I don't always buy it. It's a great marketing ploy, but this is my view, my own personal view. Okay, so what is design thinking? And this is, again, my view of design thinking based from what I've seen and what my view is, and taking note of the fact that many facilitators and lecturers and consultancies carry out design thinking courses at huge expense, and the educators and the facilitators really don't have an understanding of the system. So let's talk about it. So design thinking, we all know it's a human-centric approach. It's about empathizing, it's about defining, it's about ideating, it's about prototyping and testing. And it's very much, they say, very much a non-linear process. I would not like to call it, my view is it's an iterative process, but it's a non-linear process. It's a process where they talk and they iterate and they come up with solutions. And what's very interesting, it's in the user environment. It's very much a user environment. And so there's integration happening in the user environment consistently. But when I look at this, it's a non-linear process in a linear paradigm, because it's only focused. And if one can talk about the user environment or the operatory environment, it's a linear paradigm. Because why? It does not actually take consideration of the contextual environment, the ecosystem as a whole. And so what we find is a closed system. It's very much a closed system, my view, because there is no integration with that external environment at all, the macro system. And so what is design thinking? And my definition of design thinking is it's solution orientated, and it's designing in a closed system, very much a closed system. And so let's look at again. I want to bring back the Cynefin framework and talk about where design thinking sits in Snowden's Cynefin framework. Well, I believe design thinking, and I think I've seen it, is that it really sits in the simple and the complicated domains. It clearly doesn't sit in the complex because it doesn't look at the bigger picture. And so it works within the areas of the simple and the complicated. However, I've noticed that when complexity arises, I'm finding facilitators and educators trying to move complex problems into complicated or simple problems. They move them down, and it's very interesting what they do. And I'll talk about it when we get to the slide of limitations and shifts. They continuously try and move it, but it doesn't solve anything. They consistently move towards the complicated and simple. So let's talk about the evolution of design thinking. And here I'm really looking at the y-axis in terms of form, how are we making it, what is the structure, what are we making, and the context, why are we making it. And of course, the x-axis is about objects, products, and services and complex system. And we talk about the height of them, of the y-axis, really the size of influence, and the x-axis is the size of complexity. And you can see that, generally speaking, when we look at the domain and Snowden's simple problems, it's a cause and effect is known. They really, through the interactive process of user of human empathy and user empathy and understanding the customer, they give form to objects. And there's been many successful design solutions that have been developed there. But the question arises, there's also other systems and other processes that give just as good results. Again, services and products. I mean, a very good example where design thinking was used was in the development of the iStores. They used design thinking because it was made that iStores actually unpacked, used design thinking, and it was you walk into an iStore and it's a custom experience. It's a custom experience, and that's what they wanted. And so it was understanding the empathy of the solution and what does the customer want and what does the user want. Very important to understand that. And so some successful. But when we get to complex systems, designing complex systems becomes, and I would say, impossible. And this is where they tend to move down, and as I mentioned in the Cynefin framework, to complicated and the simple domain, because you can't actually design using design thinking in terms of, and what I'm seeing really in the complex system, very much so. And so one needs to look at this. So let me talk about the limits and the shifts in design thinking. I think design thinking is user focused, so it's myopic. It is very much simple, contained problems, and it's very much solution orientated. I believe it's a narrow approach, and the approach is linear, and it doesn't always, or doesn't, in my liking, define the root cause, and it tackles the symptoms of the problem only. When we look at a systems thinking mindset, it is different. It's a system focused. And I think systems thinking moves from the myopic human-centered approach to understanding that humans are in the middle of an extremely complex system. And so it moves to a nonlinear, complex, circular model. It's problem-orientated and it's holistic in its approach. And so when one looks at this, is that design thinking is very much a transactional approach. It's a process where it's short-term and it doesn't fully understand the system. It doesn't take the system into account. Where systems thinking is transformational, fully understanding the system and looks at the relationships and the connectivity and the patterns within the system. So if I have to talk about the problems with design thinking, and I want to bring it here, is that what we tend to find is that design thinking really tries to reduce and oversimplify complex problems. And it's a commonplace tactic in design thinking education. And I've seen this as it aids the comprehension and absorption of the topic. But in order to effectively educate, it has a duty to convey the complex truth which lie below the surface. And I think this is important. And somehow I've noticed that design practitioners willfully ignore these complexities. And really they prefer to wrap design thinking into digestible packages, easy processes, simple processes, and visual processes, just to make it look a lot more marketable. I think this is important. And the realities of the actual system problems reveal themselves to these so-called design thinkers, and many have been tied up in knots, and I've seen this, adding more hexagons, more feedback loops, and more layers to almost the point of absurdity. Now, it's important to understand that, and this is my view, what they're really doing and what they're actually doing is dramatically simplifying a highly complex, non-linear reality into a grotesque, oversimplified, pathetic absurdity of design to the end user. I know these are hard words, but this is my view, and it's hopefully to generate discussion in terms of how we've been indoctrinated thinking that design thinking is the greatest thing since sliced cheese for organization in terms of defining certain areas. And because it's important, and I want to highlight this again, system thinking moves from the myopic human-centered approach to understanding that humans are in the center of an extremely complex ecosystem. So we're getting to the end. So what's the answer? What's the answer? And I'm actually utilizing this quote from Fjord 2020. It says, for years, the application of user-centered and human-centered design advocated by so many of us has separated people from the ecosystem. Now designers must start to address people as part of the ecosystem rather than at the center of everything. This means designing for two sets of values, the person and the collective. And so how do we move forward? And I want to look at this, is that we've had this, the whole process of the history of systems theory. And perhaps what we need to do, perhaps what we need to do is try and integrate. And this is something which has been developing over the last number of years, but I need to get my head around it in terms of what does it mean and how do we do it? It's one thing talking about it, but how do we actually do it? System thinking in design. So what is systems design? And I scoured the literature, and I came on to me what seemed to be the most appropriate from Peter Senge in the fifth discipline. And he made a comment, which is a very valid comment, a very profound comment, that system design is an approach for getting beyond the cause and effect to patterns of behavior that surface the cause and effect, and further for identifying the underlying structure responsible for the patterns of behavior. And I think his mental model, his design, his patterns and trends and events are very visually in terms of understanding it. So how do we move forward? How do we look at it? How do we integrate systems thinking with system design? How do we move forward? I think it's something that we need to understand and how we actually need to move forward. So how do we develop the system-centered design, and how do we look at it? What do we need to do? Well, I think firstly, we need to understand and fully comprehend that design thinking is a user-centered closed system method. It's a bottom-up, but we want to integrate it. So we need to first understand that. I think that's critical. It's a user-centered method within a closed system, okay? In a linear paradigm. Now with systems thinking, we can flip that perspective, and the lens is to understand how the consequences of the solution that was defined, perhaps here in design thinking, affects the overall system based on a top-down holistic view. Important to understand that. And so the system-centered design is user-centered, pulling out the comment and the process of what we talk about in design thinking. But I think this is the critical issue, but at the complex ecosystem scale in an open system. And so what we need to do is continually zoom in and zoom out to recognize and look at the dependencies between the different parts of the system. So graphically, I showed it. We have an inside-out perspective, important, and we have an outside-in perspective. It's a continual process of understanding this, very important. Because this, what does this do? And this is something that I got from Richmond 1994, is that people embracing systems and thinking position themselves such that they can see both the forest and the trees, one eye on each. So in other words, you get let's go back to the slide. We get a view of the whole and integrating design thinking into the process. Just a point. So finally, I think it's important in terms of the systems-centered design that for designers, We need to have a mindset not to leave design thinking behind, but how we can incorporate the systems thinking mindset so that we can cover more ground, we can ask the appropriate questions at the complex level, because this is critical. This is critical. It's not a simple or complicated domain in terms of the Cynefin framework. It's complexity. We need to understand the relationships, the patterns, etc. And so what do we see? We see by applying system design, this complexity is somewhat resolved in terms of integrating design thinking into system design, with system design being perhaps the foundation of the process. So my final thought, ladies and gentlemen, is that a very profound quote by Donaletta Meadows from her book, Thinking in Systems, 2008. A very profound, and we need to all understand this. We can't impose our will on the system. We can listen to what the system tells us and discover how it operates. And our values can work together to bring forth something much better than could ever be produced by our will alone. I thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Greg Tosen. That was indeed very, very insightful and interesting. We do have a lot of comments for you, and I think
good.
You can show yourself.
I'm going to show myself.
You can
I've got
show
a background
yourself.
that shouldn't be there, but don't worry, I'm there.
It's all right. I'm just going to stop the recording because we need to actually upload this to our